I'm here to talk about the origin of United Nations, and in this regard, I will talk about the nature, role, and also the functions of the UN. What I did was I organized my presentation in form of a number of basic questions that we need to address. First of all, what is the United Nations? The UN is a multi-purpose international organization with universal membership among the countries in the world. The UN was established on 24 October 1945 by 51 countries committed to preserving peace throughout, through international cooperation and collective security. With 191 members, almost all states in the world are officially members of the UN nowadays. And rising from the ashes of the World War II, the UN has three major goals. First, protecting international peace. Second, promoting prosperity among nations. Third, publicizing human rights. Now, why do we need the United Nations? The UN has been the recipient of 8 Nobel Peace Prizes in recognition of its work. In a world plagued by conflict, the UN permits instant consultation among states. The UN helps build economies and stabilizes markets, and that is extremely important in a globalized world. The UN protects vulnerable groups like children, women, refugees, minorities, and the disabled. And just to quote a quick figure from the World Bank, 80% of the world's poor are women and children. Now, in continuation with the question, why do we need the UN? The UN provides the machinery for setting technical and legal standards. Today we heard a number of ideas about why we consider UN to be a failure. Part of it is because of the rising expectation. We expect a lot more from the UN than we give it actually, we give it power to resolve. The UN is a catalyst for action on major global issues such as the environment. In fact, with all that the UN does, it's hard to imagine a world without the UN. And as you could notice, even those people who disagree with a number of activities that the UN has cannot see us Americans pulling out from it or for the organization to just wither away. Thus, many insist that if we did not have the UN, it would have been invented very soon. Now, another important question is the UN a world government? The UN is not and was never intended to be a world government. As an organization of sovereign or independent state, it does only what members have already agreed it can do. The UN is an instrument of its members. In other words, the UN is only a servant, not a master of its member states. Do states surrender their sovereignty at the UN? This has been always one of the concerns, especially for patriotic Americans. The members of the UN are all sovereign states. In fact, sovereignty is, strongly protected in the UN Charter, and very frankly, in the practical terms, that sometimes end up being one of the major problems UN has to deal with. Working with other states is an exercise of sovereignty, not a limitation of it. Countries voluntarily decide to work together because they feel it is in their best interest. Countries think about national interests. It's not just the US, all countries of the world think in those ways. Very few countries in the world just think in terms of humanitarian efforts. The UN provides the common grounds where states can achieve maximum benefits from cooperation, while state sovereignty is protected. Is the UN a tool of the big powers? That's another question. The UN is the instrument of all its members. In the General Assembly, all states have the same voting rights, making it the most democratic international institution. Even in the Security Council, the permanent members must take the views of others and cannot impose their own will. In short, no country alone can dictate UN policies, including the United States. Now, how is the UN organized? The UN has 6 major organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, which is also known as Ecosoc, the Trusteeship Council, and the International Court of Justice, which is known also as ICJ, and the Secretariat. The General Assembly is the unique word form where all member states are represented. It can be called also a parliament of the nations. It is here that the world's most pressing ideas and problems are addressed, such as AIDS. Each member state has only one vote. The votes are often an accurate measure of the world opinion, even if the countries which are there by themselves, they do not fit our definition of a democracy. The General Assembly makes a number of decisions. Major decisions like the UN budget and admitting new members take two-thirds majority. Other decisions take only a simple majority. In recent years, however, special efforts are made to reach decisions through consensus rather than taking formal vote. It holds regular sessions from September to December, and it meets for emergency session anytime it has to. A few words about Security Council. The primary role of Security Council is to maintain international peace and security. It convenes whenever peace is threatened. Under the UN Charter, all member states are obligated to carry out its decisions. It has 5 permanent members, and the other 10 are elected by the Assembly for 2 years. A decision cannot be made if there is a veto, and the idea of veto was one of the ideas of the Founding Fathers, to provide a particular privilege to certain members of the international community. More about Security Council. Facing a threat to peace, the Council first explores ways to settle the dispute peacefully. It may suggest principles for a settlement or undertake mediation. During a war, the Council tries to secure a ceasefire. It may send UN's peacekeepers, who have received a number of awards, although not all of them have been successful efforts. It may take measures to enforce decisions. It can impose sanctions, embargo, or even collective military action. We saw that the embargo and the boycotts of the South African products eventually had an impact on the large economy of South Africa. A little bit about Economic and Social Council. Ecosoc coordinates the economic and social work of the UN system. Ecosoc plays a key role in fostering international cooperation for development. It consults with the NGOs, thereby maintaining vital links between the UN and civil society. Its subordinate bodies focus on such issues as crime prevention, status of women, drug trafficking, and so on, a number of issues which are high on the agenda of the United States. The Trusteeship Council. It provided international supervision for 11 trust territories administered by 7 members and ensured territories' preparation for self-government and independence. By 1994, all territories gained self-rule. This was one of the other major contributions of the UN which has been rather ignored. Okay? In other words, UN has been extremely successful in decolonization process. This council amended its rule to allow it to meet as and when the occasion may require, and this could be perhaps one compromising position between our position in the United States and that of the UN in terms of who should have sovereignty on a temporary basis in Iraq. International Court of Justice, known also as the World Court, is the main judiciary organ of the UN. With 15 judges, ICJ decides disputes between countries. States voluntarily participate in the proceedings, but if a state agrees to participate, then it's obligated to comply with the ICJ decision. ICJ also provides advisory opinions to UN and the UN systems. The Secretariat. It carries out the administrative work of the UN as directed by General Assembly, Security Council, and other organs. Its head, the Secretary General, provides the overall administrative guidelines. Drawn from the 170 states, the Secretariat consists of offices with a total staff of 7,500 under regular budget and nearly equal number under special funding. So if you consider the amount of work that the UN does with such a small staff, it seems it looks much better than what we think about it. Major UN accomplishment. The UN formulated the historic Universal Declaration of Human Rights. UN peacekeeping is a vital tool for peace. UN environmental conventions reduced acid rain in Europe and America, cut marine pollution globally, and has protected ozone layer in the last decade or so. UN agencies have succeeded in numerous developmental projects in a variety of states, and we have a tendency to ignore that. UN has developed more international law in the last 50 years than in the previous history. 3 million children annually are saved by the immunization program of the UN agencies. Global air travel is safer thanks to the UN International Civil Aviation Organization. And finally, the UN food program provides about 1/3 of the global food aid each year. These are only a few of the numerous UN achievements in the past decades. Now, what are some of the UN challenges and what is its future? Despite its achievement, the UN has also experienced failure due to its constraints, like sovereignty. Thus, the UN has much to learn and improve in its rules, methods, organization, and operation. In our increasingly interdependent world, however, there is no replacement for the UN, as Congressman Lou Frey has already suggested. Even the U.S. needs the UN. Our efforts in the last couple of weeks going to UN, trying to get help for the Iraqi situation is a very good example of that. So we need the UN, whose major goals are compatible with about almost 75% of the U.S. Foreign policy goals. Usually I suggest to my students, if you find somebody that you're compatible about 50% of your major goals, marry them before somebody else does. Okay? The U.S. might not be pleased with all UN decisions, but we should remember that our failure to support the League of Nations led not only to the failure of this organization, but also to a major conflict. We cannot make such unilateral decisions anymore. Thank you.
My topic, I'm glad this is called Academic Perspectives on the UN, because my topic might be one of those that only an academic could love. And that is, I'm going to discuss a little bit, and not in too much detail, about a recent decision of the International Court of Justice, which of course is a UN organ. The court's decision in a case called Congo versus Belgium, insofar as that decision impacts upon a legal principle called head of state immunity, which in its simplest terms simply protects heads of state from prosecution for in this case, serious violations of international criminal law. Now, one might think, well, that is purely an academic topic, except that this issue, and more specifically the dispute that gave rise to this issue, at least indirectly, has gotten a lot of public attention lately. The Congo versus Belgium case was precipitated by Belgium's attempt to prosecute the then foreign minister of the Congo, Mr. Eurodia, for inciting genocide. And Belgium did so under a Belgian law which gives it universal jurisdiction over serious violations of the international criminal law, specifically war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Belgium, and perhaps Spain, but certainly Belgium is unique in this regard, in that this law gives Belgium the power to prosecute even if none of the criminal acts took place on Belgian soil, even if no Belgian is responsible for any of the criminal acts, and even if no Belgian nationals are the victims of any of these criminal acts, what we international lawyers might call pure universal jurisdiction. Congo challenged this assertion of jurisdiction in the International Court of Justice, and that's what led to the court's opinion. Now, the court, in that regard, decided that there was a form of head of state immunity that protects heads of state essentially from criminal prosecution in national courts, and this is an important point to underscore, in national courts, for any criminal acts those heads of state committed while they were in office that were their public acts. And the court in this regard distinguishes between public and private acts. After a head of state leaves office, he or she may be prosecuted for private criminal acts committed while in office. But as far as public acts are concerned, there is a complete immunity from prosecution in national courts. Now, I think it's important to think about that concept of public acts a little bit when we consider the nature of the jurisdiction of, or the nature of international criminal law, and specifically what violations it covers: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It seems to me to be almost difficult, if not impossible, to argue that any of those violations would be committed by a head of state for his or her private purposes. For example, one of the best known examples is, of course, the Pinochet case, which involves torture, which is closely related to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And there, of course, Pinochet, I believe, would have a strong argument that he didn't order the torture of other individuals for his own personal benefit, but rather to further some policy, however misguided, of his own government. And of course, I think Hitler could have made precisely the same argument in Nazi Germany prior to and during the Second World War. So, what's the problem here? Well, the problem here comes about when we look at this decision, Congo versus Belgium, within the context of the new International Criminal Court. And again, I want to correct something that was misstated earlier. The International Criminal Court is not part of the United Nations. It was created as a result of a UN-sponsored treaty, which has now been ratified by more than 60 countries, which was the number of countries that was necessary in order to bring the treaty into effect. But the ICC will operate independently of and not directly under the umbrella of the United Nations. So it is not like the ICJ. It's not a UN organ in that regard. Well, the ICC sets up a rather complex jurisdictional mechanism, and among the crimes that the ICC can prosecute, or exempted rather, from the list of crimes that the ICC can prosecute, are those which states are prosecuting. In fact, the primary jurisdictional principle upon which the ICC is founded is a principle with the somewhat strange name of complementarity. And complementarity simply means that the states, individual states, have primary jurisdiction with regard to the prosecution of those international crimes that are within the ICC's jurisdiction: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And this is because prosecutions in national courts have always been the mainstay of this system of enforcement. I worked for a time as an adjunct to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And just to give you some examples, there are approximately 3,500 individuals in the former Yugoslavia that are suspected war criminals. It would have been impossible for the International Tribunal to ever handle that number or that volume of cases. And so it was always anticipated that most of those prosecutions would take place in the national courts. And the only exception to this preference for national jurisdiction in the ICC treaty is in those instances where a state is unwilling or unable to genuinely prosecute or undertake a prosecution of an offender. And so, again, from the perspective of an academic and an academic lawyer, the question that this raises for me is, what effect would it have on the ICC's jurisdiction? And I think, again, it's important here to note that head of state immunity is not a defense in the International Criminal Court. It's specifically abolished by the treaty, as it was in the ICTY, in the ICTR, in the Nuremberg tribunals, and in the tribunals that took place in the Far East tribunals that took place at the end of the Second World War. So head of state immunity is not a defense in any of those international fora, but it is a defense to prosecution. It will bar prosecution in national courts. So here's my hypothetical. Here's my academic hypothetical, and it's not so far-fetched because under the Belgian law, there is a serious case against the current sitting Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon. And there's a possibility that that case could be expanded to include acts that have taken place since the ICC treaty went into effect. So the question becomes, what happens if a state undertakes the prosecution of its own head of state or a former head of state, and then during the course of that prosecution determines that the head of state is entitled to immunity because the international crimes that were ordered by the head of state were public acts? Is that a situation where the ICC will intervene to say, no, this is a situation where you have either been unwilling or unable genuinely to prosecute someone who's accused of a serious international crime? It seems to me that this is going to be a difficult position for the ICC to take, considering the fact that the ICJ, its sister court, has sanctioned precisely this form of immunity. And I think we can see in conclusion how this decision in Congo versus Belgium, which I intend to argue in a forthcoming article, was hastily arrived at and ill-considered, potentially puts certain states, and among them perhaps even the United States, because of course our last two presidents, our current president and President Clinton, have both been accused, I think not terribly seriously, of war crimes or crimes against humanity in connection with military operations that we have conducted. So precisely the same argument could apply to us. And does this put states on a collision course with the new International Criminal Court and potentially even the United Nations? Thank you.
You may be wondering how we got the title here, the United Nations in a neo-medieval world, and I thought I'd pick a title that might be a little catchy to see where we might go and surprise you as we're going along. The notion of a neo-medieval world comes from one of Britain's most prescient observers of the international system, an individual called Hedley Bull, Professor Bull. And in his 1977 work called The Anarchical Society, he gave us the notion that the international system was what he called neo-medieval. By this, Professor Bull meant that states were one of a number of actors with overlapping authority and multiple loyalty, thus the medieval analogy of conflicting loyalty between the king and the papacy in Rome. Professor Bull noted such trends as, 1, regional integration. The European Union in his time, for example, had neither the nation-state nor the European Union as essentially the sovereign over one another and provided a rather complex arrangement. He noted the balkanization of the system in his time. And by this, he wasn't referring so much to the creation of new states, but rather the autonomous authority of ethnic groups within a state to govern themselves and or interact with similar groups in other states. For example, the Kurds in Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Or what he would not have known in his time, but since then an excellent example would be the Palestinian Authority in the Middle East. He noted the emergence of the increase in private international violence And what he meant by this was terrorism, international criminal organizations, drug cartels, private security, police, and military forces, all of which undermined the state's monopoly of the employment of violence, which historically was one of the elements of the notion of sovereignty of the state system and its prominence in the international system. He also noted the impact of global technology, in part because of nuclear weapons which made the state permeable and borderless. And finally, he noted the transnational organizations, their proliferation in his era, including multinational corporations, political movements, non-governmental organizations, religious movements, and intergovernmental organizations. In this last regard, I might parenthetically add, to give you some notion of to what extent his notion of neo-medievalism has been writ large today. In the opening of the 20th century, there were 176 non-governmental organizations and 31 intergovernmental organizations. It gives us a total of 213. At the end of the 20th century, there were 40,306 non-governmental organizations and 6,115 intergovernmental organizations, for a total of 46,421. And not all of these are under the UN rubric. Indeed, many of them are alternates or alternatives to the United Nations. But Bull, to some extent, was ahead of his time. Much had not yet taken place. Those events which he did analyze have quickly accelerated far beyond his predictions. He had no idea, for example, that there would be an internet connecting individuals globally and challenging the state's monopoly over public information. East European law has now superseded the law of its member states in various administrative, labor, trade, and financial areas. There are now transnational codes of conduct for multinational corporations. And has previously been mentioned now, a dream for over a century in the international system has finally materialized, the International Criminal Court. We can also include the emergence in more recent decade of such sub-state actors as states within the United States, each conducting their own foreign policies and trade relations with other states and cities in other parts of the world, as well as having economic impact by boycotting the products of various states and other entities when it does not comply with their own values. There are also sub-state arrangements among states themselves in even the setting of the European Union, which would seem to defy what it was the Union was all about. We have what's known as an Alpine Diamond Agreement between Geneva, Turin, and Lyon, three of the countries in the European system, all of which have their own economic trade relations with one another. To what extent have all these kinds of trends then fundamentally altered the nation-state system? While the UN increased its visibility and stature in the early post-Cold War world event of Gulf War I, so also did Gulf War II underscore, on the other hand, the central role that nation-states still play in international politics inside and outside the UN chambers, thus underscoring what Professor Sadri said: the UN remains an organization of states. There are a couple of caveats we probably ought to mention in working my way toward a quick conclusion here with you, before we simply say that the new millennium is more business as usual, and instead suggest that probably Professor Bull was ahead of his time and quite right. First to think about, was the state-centric system prolonged because of the Cold War? In other words, were numerous state entities perceived as important and worthy of underpinning when in fact they were not, and therefore, now that the ideological competition between the major powers of the world has subsided, these independent entities make less and less sense. Number two, the notion of the revolution and rising expectations. All of us were introduced to these notions as graduate students since the latter 1950s. This revolution has not abated, but rather has intensified, and consequently it has put many states into overload. The states cannot meet the expectations. Indeed, the literature now talks increasingly of failed states, systems that simply cannot function. We have, unfortunately, a plethora of these in Africa, Middle East, Asia. In the Middle East, for example, since 1980, the population of the Middle East has doubled. At the same time, its involvement in the international economic system has precipitously declined. In 1980, 1 out of every $7 in international trade was Middle East. Today, that figure is $1 in every $25. So while we've doubled the population, we have minimized economic and financial activity, the revolution of rising expectations is certainly writ large in the Middle East, and the challenges for these political systems are truly, truly challenging. Since they increasingly are unable to meet such expectations, scholars are increasingly recognizing that people are looking elsewhere for fulfillment of their needs, such as the specialized agencies of the United Nations, which both of our congressmen earlier today mentioned. They're also looking to regional organizations. In the case of human rights violations, if you cannot seek satisfaction within your own system, you can go to the European Commission on Human Rights. Private transnational associations. Some of you may be involved in the humanitarian efforts of Rotary International, or Doctors Without Borders, or Habitat for Humanity. These are obviously options other than looking to governments. There are also options for individuals to look to private police, military, and unfortunately terrorist forces when their own states cannot provide the type of security they seek, such as Hamas, for example, in the Middle East. We also have to mention that there are an increasing number of non-state actors that transcend national boundaries who do not have the betterment of the planet Earth in mind, nor the preservation of the nation-state system in mind. International criminal, terrorist, and religious organizations that in many cases are more powerful financially and militarily than the states in which they operate. Such entities are exerting an increasing influence over people and the international economy and undermining state power. Susan Strange, for example, of the London School of Economics and Political Science, noted in her 1999 work, The Retreat of the State, The Diffusion of Power in the World Economy, that organized crime in Russia controls 35% of the banks, 40% of industry, 60% of commerce, and 80% of foreign joint ventures. This is not government. This is private activity. Another point to consider in looking at what happens in the new millennium here is agenda setting. Historically, it was states that drove the agenda in international politics and determined the items that would be considered at conferences. Today, agenda setting is done far more diffusely than by states. It is done, for example, by individuals. When we think of the Landmine Convention, for example, and we trace it back to its genesis, back to its origin, this was one lady who had an idea, and eventually the international system banned landmines. This was not a government. We have conferences of parties and more treaties in the international system who, when they meet, literally legislate rather than recommend. And they do so by democratic means, by 2/3 votes. And indeed, they can change the treaty itself. Historically, these were unanimous considerations because states were sovereign. We have transcended that notion in this new millennium. Furthermore, in talking about nation states and the United Nations or other agencies, the 21st century may indeed be a century where the important things are not what the politicians have talked about this morning. It may not be the Iraqs. It may not be the North Koreas. It may not be the Irans. Instead, the problems of the 21st century are global social problems and economic problems rather than political problems. It is the maldistribution of food. It is the increasing scarcity of water around the planet. It is the population pressure upon the resources of the globe and the ability of people to respond to rising expectations. It's the adverse impact upon the environment in which all of us live. And it is the pandemic of AIDS globally. This is the problem and the agenda for the new millennium. Such observations therefore challenge the notion that the state-centric international system remains the key feature of the contemporary international system and underscores Professor Bull's notion of a neo-medieval world in a new millennium. Many argue that the UN has increasingly become an alternative to the nation-state and represents Professor Bull's neo-medieval system writ large. The UN, for example, has had a central role in creating an accelerated range of legal norms in the areas of the global environment, the law of the sea, outer space, human rights, arms control, legislation against terrorism and torture, rights of women and children, and expanding its influence in such areas as international administrative law, international criminal law, international labor law, and international commercial law. However, and in conclusion, I'd be happy to hear that, while such examples underscore the increased role of the UN, at the same time it underscores the challenge to the United Nations and its specialized agencies. For the nation-state system that emerged in the 16th and 17th century will remain viable well into the future and compete with other actors for the loyalty of its citizens. Indeed, one of the fundamental problems of the UN, as was alluded to by several people previously, is it depends upon the nation-state system for its funding. And without its funding, it cannot be effective. And this becomes a real dilemma then in what it sets as the viable, doable agenda given its financial dependency. Thus, there will remain Professor Bull's notion of a neo-medieval world with an increasing complexity of interrelationships which will require an even more complex international order that is being highlighted by such new additions to the old UN standby as the World Trade Organization, the previously mentioned International Criminal Court, the International Seabed Authority and its attendant judicial organs, and perhaps before too long, a World Space Agency. None of these which are specialized agencies of the United Nations. Consequently, the proliferation of areas of opportunity to meet the needs and the demands of individuals is accelerating at an impressive pace. Thank you.